All right, well, I'm going to get us started. If folks continue to join, that is fantastic. But because these sessions are so short, I want to get us started so you can hear the fantastic content that we have for you this afternoon. So, hi, welcome to the Center of Excellence for Infant and Early Childhood Mental Health Consultations Conference, Equity from the Start. My name is Lauren Rabinowitz. I will be serving today as your session facilitator. I am joined by Sarita, who will serve as our technology host. This session is being recorded. You should have just seen that pop-up message. Transcription is available through the Zoom platform. And if you have any questions, please feel free to use the chat function, and Sarita and myself will be paying close attention for any needs that you may have. We also want to let you know before we begin that the views, policies, and opinions expressed in this presentation are those of the author and do not necessarily reflect those of SAMHSA or HHS. So that being said, I am going to pass this over to Rachel, who's going to be conducting this fantastic workshop. Thank you so much, Rachel.
Great, thank you all so much, and I'm so glad that you're all here. I'm joining you from Colorado today, where it is currently very sunny, and I love that some of you are starting to introduce yourself in the chat, so please feel free to go ahead and do that. Today, we're going to be talking about consulting about challenging behavior and the role of adult perception. So just very briefly, a little bit about me, because we don't have a lot of time together today. I work at the University of Colorado, Denver. I'm dually credentialed as a psychologist and school psychologist, and I focus on early childhood mental health with a whole variety of topics underneath that, including how we identify young children's needs, workforce development, and other things like that. So if any of those are of interest to you, I welcome conversations at a later date. But today, we have a few learning objectives that I hope we will be able to accomplish together. I want you to be able to gain an understanding of the role and impact of bias in educator practices in early education settings. And really, this could extend to all adults working with young children. I also want you to become familiar with strategies and tools to confront your own biases and potentially biased practices, and to consider how to apply tools and strategies within consultative relationships. So there's a lot in there. We're going to do our best to accomplish as many of those as we can in probably 45 minutes or so. Hold on, it's going to be a quick read through these topics. I did want to include a few session norms, and because of the limited time, we won't have extensive opportunities for conversation, but I do think that the topics we're addressing today often make people feel challenged, and I want to recognize that that's part of the growth process. And our goal is not to agree, but to gain deeper understanding. When we talk about addressing our own perceptions, it's very usual to feel challenged and sometimes to disagree in those moments, in those conversations. And so it's our own process in doing this work, and also a parallel process to the experience we likely have when working with colleagues and other providers in this space. And if there's one thing that I hope you walk away from this session with today, it's self-reflection, shifting our perception of young children's challenging behavior. And oftentimes when I give these talks, folks who come to these sessions perhaps already buy into a lot of these ideas, but many times who we're consulting with, who we're working with, that can be a harder sell. And so recognizing that our own self-reflection and encouraging that self-reflection in our colleagues and in others we work with is an important first step. All right, so we're going to get into a little bit of background first, and then we'll move into some of our strategies in a few minutes. So first of all, I'm sure this is no surprise to many of you present this afternoon, but typical development and challenging behavior go hand in hand. Biting, aggression, defiance, tantrums, these are all things that we often see in young children. And whether or not these are developmentally inappropriate or something of concern really depends. These can be very challenging, and that doesn't necessarily mean that they are unexpected. To put this in another context, this graph just shows this was parent-reported data that looked at how often they reported that their preschooler or infant and toddler engaged in 3 big categories of challenging behavior. So tantrums, disobeying for no reason, and being aggressive, frustrated, angry, or upset. And the big takeaway from this is that you can see most children engage in these behaviors some of the time, but very few of them engage in these behaviors a lot of the time, and they did that as every day or more. So we're really looking at not just the types of behaviors, but the frequency of behaviors, and that's when we reach a point where challenging behaviors are perhaps outside of what we would expect for most children most of the time. I also want to acknowledge before we move on that even normative behaviors can be very challenging. And I think this sometimes gets lost in these conversations. We can have challenging behaviors that warrant support and intervention, and that doesn't mean they're not normative. Anyone who has parented or cared for a child has experienced this. I have 2 young children of my own, and can attest to feeling very challenged by them, despite not having any indication that their behaviors are not typical or expected. So because of this, we have to think about this in a relational context, and that will bridge us later on into thinking about this in terms of consultation. But challenging behavior, whether it's normative or something that is beyond what we might expect, is linked to a variety of different things. So we know that when a child is exhibiting challenging behavior, it's linked to more negative attributions of the young children's behavior, and it really interferes with how early educators form strong relationships. So, I mean, not surprising. It's hard to form a relationship with a child you're feeling really challenged by and who's causing a lot of disruption in your classroom or other spaces. But the data supports that as well. We also know that when challenging behaviors are present, there's a failure to recognize mental health and trauma, or the challenging behaviors might mask or hide what else might be going on. And we also see that executive functioning skills are actually impacted when challenging behavior is going on. The data hasn't been able to tease apart the directionality of that, but likely there's some bidirectional processes happening there. So when we look at data from early childhood educators, and I have no reason to believe this isn't similar across other contexts as well, there are a list of terms that tend to come up as the most reported challenging behaviors. And this particular list comes out of some data that I collected a couple of years ago. And we see things or hear things like defiance, injuring others, manipulation, defiant behaviors or physically attacking others and showing no remorse, headbanging, lying to get out of trouble or get others in trouble, and blatant disrespect. And so, naturally, a lot of things on here are challenging for adults in group settings. But one thing to note here, and we'll get into this more, is there's a lot of what I call coded language here, where I really ask myself the question of problem for whom. And something like defiance tends to be a problem for the adults in the setting. They're interpreting that relationship, that interaction, as the child not listening to them or disrespecting them. So oftentimes children do struggle with their big behaviors, and it isn't always pleasant for them, but certain things like this might really be more about the adults in the situation than about the child themselves. And so we'll continue to talk about that. I'm sure this is a familiar saying for all of you, that all behavior has meaning. We were having a little sidebar conversation before everyone came into the Zoom room this afternoon about the shift between talking about a child seeking attention versus connection. And so all behavior has meaning, but also how we understand that meaning is filtered through our own language and our own adult perception and processes. All right, so that brings us to this idea of adult perception. And of course, we are the ones who are filtering all of the information in our classrooms, in our consultative relationships, in our other contexts as we do this type of work. And we are constantly evaluating behavior. So some of the things that we tend to evaluate when we see what's happening are perceived competence. So do we think that this child is doing something because they aren't capable of doing something different, or do they have the capability? And we tend to perceive that they're making a choice, whether that's always accurate or not. That's a very common adult perception. We look at systemic supports around behavior. We look at the impact on the classroom, and that's often a huge one. Sometimes if we had a child with challenging behavior and we just had that child to worry about, and maybe if some of you are in contexts where that's possible, that's very different than if we're talking about a classroom full of children where we're having to evacuate the classroom because one child's behaviors are so big and getting in the way of other children's experience. So we're thinking about that piece. We're often thinking about prior experience. I'm sure if we were in a place where I could do a show of hands, many of you could think of times where you were working with a child that brought up examples from prior experiences that you've had that influenced how you understood the current situation that you were working with. We also have to think about the ability to consider the child's perspective, and this is one of my absolute favorite things that early childhood mental health brings to the table in terms of things like the wondering stance and recognizing what is the child's experience in this situation. When I was doing work in K-12 settings, we didn't often consider that unless the child verbally told us. And I think it's so important for us who work with children who maybe are pre-verbal or becoming verbal, that we recognize what is the child's experience or perspective potentially or likely like under these circumstances. And then of course our adult biases, and they're happening all the time in everything that we do, and they contribute to how we understand and evaluate behavior as well. All right, so why does this matter? First of all, we all have biases around all kinds of different things, and so they're often automatic and things that we frequently are not aware of unless we have something happen that brings them to our awareness. We are all influenced by these biases. So again, it's the example I said earlier, something like saying, oh, this child is seeking attention, which could be a bias that comes out of our training or our background, to then being able to catch that and say, well, maybe this child is seeking connection. And both could describe what's happening, but it changes our understanding of it, and our own biases or ideas can influence kind of what word or what idea comes to mind automatically. So we also need to be thinking about other stereotypes that affect our understanding. They are usually unconscious, but can bring us to have feelings or beliefs or prejudice towards or against someone or something. This could be due to all kinds of different characteristics about them, including their identity. We often talk about implicit versus explicit biases. So explicit are the biases that you're aware of, versus implicit biases are the ones that you likely are not aware of. And we see this come out and kind of have this cross section with young children's challenging behavior, even when we hear terms like challenging. And I'm using that a lot because I honestly am at lack of a really better descriptor, but even that word in and of itself has a lot of connotations. We also, when we hear things like disruptive or defiant, like I mentioned earlier, those are words that often have a lot of implicit bias built into them. And these have been shown to affect educators' perceptions and actions. All right, so taking this a little bit further, we know that data on school discipline clearly demonstrates that Black preschool children are far more likely than their white peers to receive out-of-school suspensions and expulsions. And so this is one of many examples, but a very clear example of how the adult perceptions or the adult biases are helping us interpret challenging behaviors in a way that has a negative consequence for children. And we have very clear data that preschoolers are expelled at a rate more than 3 times that of grades K-12, which again, in an early childhood audience, I don't imagine that's something you're unfamiliar with, but when I present to other audiences, people are often still shocked to hear that. And we have work from Gilliam and colleagues in 2016 and others since then that have demonstrated that adult racial and gender biases were clearly part of their decision making when evaluating young children's behavior. So it's not only that we have challenging behavior happen, which, as we already saw, we expect, but it's also how adults address and think about the behaviors that they're encountering. We know that adult perceptions and biases have been linked to practices in early education settings. And one of the ways that we see this happen is adultification, or this quote here says, adultification is perceiving a child as older and more mature, and anger bias, perceiving anger where it does not exist. And these are two phenomena disproportionately imposed on Black children compared to white children. So one of the many different ways that our implicit biases come out is in terms of race. And we, again, have very clear data that can change how we judge and evaluate a child's behavior. So if we think a child is older than they are, or we're perceiving them as older, then we might expect something different from them than if we are able to evaluate them at their actual chronological age. So again, thinking about the relational impacts, young children can engage in challenging behavior for many, many different reasons, but one of the most common is because they need connection and adult attention. They need that engagement, but the labels given to these behaviors is where that adult perception, that bias comes into these situations. So again, the things like defiance, being bad, stubborn, these suggest adult tendencies to assume that young children can change these behaviors if they choose. And the data that I have been collecting, which is from a broad cross-section of early childhood educators, suggests that this language is still very, very common. And a lot of people have these ideas or use these types of words to describe behaviors that they're experiencing. I'm curious, again, we don't have a lot of time together this afternoon, but if anyone is able to put in the chat if you've encountered this type of language in the work that you're doing. I see if some responses coming in, and they are all affirmative that you see and experience this in your work. And that's my experience as well. So what does this do for relationships? And again, when we get into consultation in a moment, we can kind of talk about how we address this. But for children who are perceived to have more behavior problems, and again, under the umbrella of all of that language we were talking about, whether these behaviors are quote unquote a problem or not, if they're perceived as being by the adults, by the educators in those relationships, we see higher levels of conflict in those relationships and less teacher-child closeness. So it definitely has an impact in terms of the relationship, and it also changes teacher treatment towards students. So some research by Dobbs and Arnold, which is a little bit old already at this point, found that teachers gave more commands to children they perceived as having more behavior problems. So it changes the types of interactions that are happening, and teacher perceptions on child behavior are associated with teachers' negative affective responses as well. And this is mediated by teachers' mental representations of their relationship with the child. So not only is there's a bidirectional influence on the relationship, and the teacher's perception is a huge part of that. And so you can imagine what that does for a child's experience in a classroom in that setting. We already looked at some of the data here, but teachers tend to practice harsher discipline with children who exhibited disruptive or aggressive behaviors. And we can very easily get into a cycle, a pattern of that happening over and over in a way that a child either loses access to the experiences they should be having, or ultimately ends up in a situation where there's exclusionary discipline taking place. when Gilliam and Reyes did some more recent research and looked at the tendency for a preschool child to be expelled, and found that it was based on some common factors. So teachers' perception that the child's behaviors are disruptive, teachers' fear of being accountable for the child's behavior that may cause harm to the self or others. And this is one that I hear a lot of, and I imagine you encounter a lot in your own work, where the teacher is worried about what other people will think. They're getting pressure from parents or administrators because a child is biting, and other people are getting concerned, and that kind of external behavior also makes the teacher kind of not sure what to do, or wanting that child perhaps even out of their classroom. And then, of course, teachers' perceived level of stress caused by the child's behavior. So if we have a teacher who feels very competent and feels like they know how to deal with challenging behavior, that's going to be a very different experience than if we have the same set of behaviors with a teacher who feels like they don't know what to do and doesn't have the tools to address what's happening. I love this quote. I think, this is kind of at the extreme end of challenging behaviors, but the idea that preschool expulsion is not a child behavior, it's an adult decision. So we will see these behaviors, challenging behaviors, as we already talked about, is a normative part of working with all children to some degree, and especially young children. But what we do about it is an adult decision, and how we respond is an adult decision. I want to just say a little bit more on racial disproportionalities before we get into the consultation piece. And we just have so much data that continues to pile up about how these adult perceptions and biases contribute to the behavioral responses in ways that often aren't good for children. So Black children are more likely to be suspended from school or receive harsher punishments than white children. White teachers are more likely to have lower behavioral expectations for Black preschoolers, whereas Black educators held higher behavioral standards for the same group of children. And some more recent research found that teachers reported more conflictual relationships with Black boys compared to other boys, as well as more close relationships with white boys compared to other boys. So again, race is not the only type of bias that can enter into these decisions, but we know that that's frequently happening. And when we talk about something like the school to prison pipeline, we have to think about how to disrupt these biases when we're evaluating these challenging behaviors that we know we're going to see and encounter. We see this throughout the lifespan, so not just in our early education settings, but then this continues on into our later education settings. Black children who are perceived as nearing adolescent, typo there, were misperceived as angry at a greater rate than their white counterparts, and Black children have been 18 times more likely than white children to be sentenced as adults rather than children in the justice system. So again, just knowing that this is happening throughout our systems, where the implicit bias is influencing not only what happens, but the decision making and the outcomes that come from the behaviors. Okay, so against that backdrop, kind of what do we do about this? And I'm just curious, in as much as you can say in a few words, who we have with us today. If you could put a couple of words in the chat about where you do your consulting work, what types of settings are you currently in, before we get into this conversation. Right, looks like lots of different things coming in. I saw Head Start in there. I saw preschools, early childcare settings. Some people mentioned the environments they're in as being rural in particular. I think I saw maybe urban in there as well. Might have missed it. Great. So we are all in different types of settings. Where we are working with educators, with colleagues, with others in a variety of different settings, whether we're talking directly to those educators or perhaps in a setting where we're one step removed. and trying to address all of the challenges that we just named in terms of a consultation relationship. And this is a very tricky place to be, as I'm sure you all are well aware from your work, because sometimes we can see what's happening or recognize some of the challenges and problems, and we're trying to help others recognize that as well. And that's always a hard role to be in, but when we're talking about our own and others' biased perceptions, that it's very hard at times to help others recognize how that's influencing the work that they're doing. All right, so the moving into kind of the bulk of or the heart of what we're going to talk about today, the intersection. So when adult bias meets young children's challenging behavior, and how do we address that through a consultative relationship? So, of course, when we're addressing children's challenging behavior and helping support our colleagues who are doing this work, all of the things that we have, the skills we've learned, the things that we've done in the past certainly don't go away. So we want to be considering things like root causes. Is there a trigger that we can remove from the environment? Great. I love when we can do that. Let's not have children be triggered and have challenging behaviors if that's an option. But they're still going to happen some of the time. Other things we might consider: changing the environment, addressing skill deficits, building adult capacity, using positive behavior supports, and providing and connecting children to mental health support. So these are all great and valid strategies, but we also have to consider the role of adult perception. So I would really say this is an example of both and. We want to think about how the adult perceptions are influencing the situation, but that doesn't mean we abandon our other effective techniques for supporting challenging behavior. Okay, so confronting adult perceptions. I know this is challenging, and I already talked about that, but we know, and the good news is that when people are motivated to control their biases, they can do so. So if we're able to help someone effectively identify biases that are influencing their decisions, their work with young children, their choices in the classroom, we can have an impact. And deciding that you do not want to act in a biased way and actively striving to adopt different beliefs and standards is possible for people who are ready and open to doing so. Implicit bias is more complicated because you have to kind of catch your automatic thoughts, and by the nature of being automatic, that's harder to do, but it also can be done. And deprogramming, they often call that catching those automatic thoughts. Deprogramming can happen through exposure. So just having additional exposure with individuals with situations that trigger those automatic thoughts. So, we tend to have a lot of that in our early childhood work and world, and just being aware and starting to catch yourself is a huge part of working to move away from those or understand your implicit biases. We also have to recognize kind of this process of self-reflection that happens, and either happens for us as consultants or that we can help our consultees work through as well. So, it's an ongoing cycle, identifying personal implicit biases, but then when you acknowledge those, then you can take meaningful action in order to mitigate and minimize the influence. So in this case, how we respond and interact with young children, or how our colleagues do, leading to active self-reflection and often identification of additional ways that our thoughts might be influenced by all of these biases that we inevitably hold. So this could be in terms of our own identity. This could be in terms of identities that maybe we hold implicit biases about. This could be about certain types of behaviors, and this could be an interaction between multiple things we're talking about. It could be certain types of behaviors from certain types of children that trigger implicit biases for us. So there's a lot of layers to really unpack when we are doing this work ourselves or doing this work as part of consultation. We also want to think about the systems. I think we're rarely very effective in addressing truly challenging behaviors if we don't have a supportive system behind us, which is hard when early childhood systems run a huge range from how robust they are, how effective they are, whether we're in isolation or part of a bigger system. But we want to be thinking about the big picture as well. So classroom level considerations. What does engagement look like? What does discipline look like? What does evaluation look like? But then also thinking about if you're part of a bigger school system, what do those systems look like? And if you're part of a district, in the case of a public education system, or some other kind of bigger system, if you're not in public education, thinking about all of the different pieces that are going to influence how supported a teacher feels, an educator feels, as well as their response to young children as well, will be part of this picture of how they are able to address and confront their perceptions as it relates to the children they work with. I also often find in these relationships and these conversations, it's really helpful to start with some key beliefs. And this can be a way to build alliance, even when we're going to have some challenging behaviors around perception and bias. Oftentimes these are key beliefs that educators and colleagues can buy into: the idea that all children can succeed, having strong and affirming relationships, and that excellence includes recognition of diversity and individual difference. But sometimes when we drill down a little bit more into these, it also will uncover some of the biases that we may hold, or that our educator or other colleagues might hold as well. When we do this work, I also want to really recognize that we have to meet people where they're at. And this is a process, as is consultation work in general. But we might be entering into doing this work at any point in this stages of change model. And this is a model that actually comes out of the counseling literature, but is very applicable to these conversations. And our goal is to help someone move through these stages of change, even if we don't get as far as we would like. So we might be having conversations with someone who's at pre-contemplation in this model. That means they are not yet recognizing their biases or how their perception is influencing their work and the challenging behaviors that they encounter. But we might, through conversation, be able to move them into the contemplation phase, where they're actively thinking about the role in their work. And that doesn't mean we're at the point of action or making change yet, but we have planted an idea. We have given them something to think about that moves them closer to a point of changing their practice, changing their work in a way that hopefully positively benefits young children. Moving further into this model, we have the determination stage, where that's where someone has recognized and decided they're going to do something but hasn't yet done it. Then we have action, where someone makes a change, they recognize their biases, they recognize the role of their perceptions, and are working to change their practices as a result. Relapse doesn't always have to happen, but sometimes we take a step backwards. This is not a linear process. And then maintenance is the continuation of changes in action. And we can move around the circle and jump in or out at various points. But I present this just as a model to think about how the work we're doing can be really impactful, even if we don't always see change during the time frame we're consulting or supporting a colleague. I also really urge you in consultation to pay attention to and draw attention to the language that's used. So going back to the idea of coded language that we talked about earlier, and I heard from many of you that you see this in your work, and you see this often every day in your work, but people often don't realize the implications or the language patterns and the meaning of the words that they're using in terms of something like a child being defiant, so I think there's a lot of power in pointing that out carefully and using our consultation skills to do that effectively. What is the words that people use? Does that tell you something about how they're perceiving the situation at hand? Is their language coded? Are there multiple layers of meaning there? Is there consistency or inconsistency across students? Do they use different language to describe the challenging behaviors of some children versus others? And then intervene carefully, asking very careful questions like, why did you choose those descriptors to describe that student? Kind of give them an opportunity to unpack and think that through a little bit more themselves. And they may be coming from a place of frustration. They may recognize that they have some sort of bias. And then also asking, what is your evidence the student is willful, defiant, etc. And that can be a nice opening as well to really unpack what does that mean for someone and what is behind those word choices. Another way that I really like to approach these conversations is sharing the data. And not everyone likes data. I work in a world of data, so I love it, but it can be really helpful to illuminate bias that might otherwise feel really abstract. And data is very concrete. And so it's nice in that sense. So can we look at attendance rates for different groups of students? Are there certain populations that are being pushed out more? We can certainly do the same with discipline data, and even kind of within a classroom setting, are there different responses to different groups of students? And so sometimes that can be a really nice way to provide descriptions or ideas around what might be happening and what you might be seeing around adult bias or adult perceptions that is really hard to argue with, and can just be a nice way to open that door and have a little bit of a bigger or more in-depth conversation. We can also use careful questioning. We can't always change bias, but we can help others recognize their bias. And if we go back to that stages of change model, that's really one of the goals here. So we can do things like offer alternative explanations. It goes back to the wondering stance, but providing a voice to the child. I wonder what this child is experiencing right now, or that idea of, well, you might be perceiving this as this child wanting attention, but I'm really seeing that they're looking for connection with you. So again, offering those different word choices, offering a different explanation for what can be happening can be really helpful, just to open up that perspective and that thinking, so that we aren't getting into these really problematic or coded ways of understanding challenging behavior. We can use open questioning. I think that's always a helpful way to understand someone's perspective. And I often see this as, if I can be the focus of some of the frustration or negative energy instead of the child, then I see that I've done something effective. And so, can we help redirect some of that by understanding our colleague, our educator's perspective, and rechannel some of what they're feeling so that the child doesn't have to experience it. All right, I know that I'm moving very quickly, as I warned you that we would. I am going to just put this in terms of a concrete example for you for the next couple of minutes, and then we should have a few minutes for questions as well. So this is just one of many possible case studies. That's really going to be a thought exercise for you to consider. But think about a first grade 6-year-old biracial boy who's new to the school, and I put this in the context of a public education setting, but you could extend much of this downward depending on the environment that you're in. And the class and school demographics in this case are about 70% white and 30% Black. But the teacher in this particular classroom is white, and the student has a history of trauma, including foster care and multiple caregivers. And early in the school year, the student begins having big behaviors that frequently require moving other students out of the classroom. So things like turning tables, throwing chairs. Academic performance is not a concern. So if we think back to some of the things that we've already covered this afternoon together, we have big challenging behaviors that are impacting the whole group of students. We also have some racial differences that we don't necessarily know what types of implicit bias or explicit bias are coming into play, but we know that they're is a school where this particular child is in the minoritized group and the teacher is of a different identity background. So you get called into this case and you consult and maybe you start with some positive behavioral interventions, but it quickly becomes clear that the teacher is not able to implement them with fidelity. And as we know, there's many possible reasons for that. Perhaps the teacher's just overwhelmed with too many kids in the classroom. I currently have a kindergartner in a class of 28 students myself, as a parent. So, we often are dealing with very large class sizes, or there's just too many other things going on and the teacher is just not able to be effective with these interventions. And by about 6 weeks into the school year, the school team is talking about another placement for the child. So we already are moving towards, we don't know what to do. How do we get this child out? So we have those group considerations that we talked earlier, and it also seems like we have a lack of perceptions of competency. The adults don't know what to do, so they want to move the child somewhere else. So just again, it's something to consider that we don't have time to get into in depth, although you're welcome to put ideas in the chat if you choose to. But what are some possible sources of bias, implicit or explicit, in this scenario? There are quite a few. How might you help the school team recognize any biases that are showing up? There's a variety of different ways you could approach this, including some of the techniques that we just talked about in terms of understanding their level of self-reflection, where they are in that cycle of change, providing some data. There's a variety of different doors you might open to help the team get a little bit further in understanding how their adult perceptions are coming into their response. And then also thinking about possible ways to intervene, either earlier on or once a change of placement is being considered. And, if we can disrupt these things earlier on, I found that's often more successful. In my experience, once we're looking at a change of placement, it's very hard to stop that train and get things to slow down. But there are still ways to do that effectively if you have a team who's willing to consult and really engage in that process with you. And I want to pose kind of one more wrinkle related to this, in terms of how your perspective or your approach might shift if you learn that this school, this particular setting, has a history of pushing boys of color out of the classroom. And so, when we initially saw this scenario, we could hypothesize about some bias-based, implicit or explicit biases that might be coming in. But if we know that the school has a history of that happening, then that might also have us consider some different strategies as we work towards a different type of response, or helping the adults check their own perceptions as they respond to the challenging behaviors. This case is actually based on a real case that I worked on, although I've seen multiple iterations of this in different ways. And so I know that this is out there and happening and perhaps resonates with some of you in your own work. And so I recognize that this is really challenging. There's a lot of layers that we're thinking about, and oftentimes we have to think about this as the long game. And of course, we want to have a positive impact for the individual child in the center of any consultation we're engaging in, but we also want to be thinking about how do we do this over time, so maybe the adults can have a different perception the next time they encounter a challenging behavior, or the next time they're working with a child who causes them to have kind of an implicit bias reaction. So, you can certainly think about it that way. I have had consultations, as I'm sure many of you have as well, that didn't end the way I had hoped. And that can be really hard in this work and in this world that we live in. But I always hold on to the idea, or I try to hold on to the idea, that maybe it had an impact for a child who came along later on, even if I wasn't there to see that, because this is really, really hard to do. And so just recognizing that it's hard to do, but we can still have an impact and make a difference, even if it's not in the moment where we can always be witness to that. All right, so I know that was a very, very quick journey through a lot of information, and I'm sorry that we can't go into more depth, but I do want to leave just a few minutes for questions that are coming up, and I'm more than happy to address them. I also will put up a slide with my email address if you would prefer to reach out at a later time. That's fine with me as well.
Rachel, thank you. Thank you so much. There is a ton of activity in the chat. Love to see this. Some of you all are connecting with each other and sharing similar experiences and how this has all resonated with you. One specific question that did pop up, and I apologize that I didn't note exactly when this question came through in relation to what you were saying, but a specific question around, do you have a tool to track various data points? That was Janina Martin. I don't know if you want to elaborate on that question, or if you wanted to unmute, or if that makes sense to you, Rachel.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a specific tool. I think there are lots of great tools out there. I think it really depends more on what will work for your environment. I mean, something as simple as behavioral tracking can be effective, or observational tracking. If you're looking at kind of classroom response data, if you are in some sort of system where you're looking at more of a disciplinary response in a bigger picture, just having every time someone turns in a form with a disciplinary concern, just keeping track of that. I mean, it doesn't have to be anything fancy. Of course, you can use that when it's appropriate, but I often think just very direct ways of measuring whatever outcome you're interested in.
Okay.
Are there other questions? I'm not keeping up with the chat, so.
Yeah, I can barely keep up with the chat. There's a lot in here. I'm seeing a lot of really lovely reflections, but I do want to make sure we didn't miss any specific questions. We do still have a few moments. Anything from anyone? And also welcome to unmute. We can unmute anyone who's interested. Lots and lots of thanks to you.
Okay.
Is that someone who's unmuted? Jessica, maybe?
I think you gotta go. And I was like, no.
Maybe not. I'll read one comment that I thought was is really insightful. Kevin O'Brien, hi Kevin, said, I'm thinking about the slide about Black educators having higher expectations for Black boys and seeing the apparent perception of choice in student behavior as a reflection of this, i.e. they know what they are doing. Have since thought of it as not developmentally attuned, but might be better considered as an affirmation of the child's potential. And several thought that was, really very thought-provoking and powerful.
Yeah, and there's some very interesting research looking at educator versus child identity and the connection between those two things. We do see some group difference level patterns, but we also know that we all hold different biases around different groups, no matter what our own identity is. And so yes, thinking about it both ways, that we all are going to have vulnerabilities and areas of strength in terms of who we are and how we work with others.
Yeah. So there actually was a question about the case that you presented. So Andrea was curious, what was your process with that case?
Yeah. Well, I will say it was an extremely good learning experience, but it was not a case where I felt particularly successful, because ultimately I was not able to persuade the team to not move the student. So the student did end up getting moved. It was a teacher in that case who was very new, and things escalated very, very quickly. I was, as I'm sure many of you are, not full-time in that setting. So I would come in once a week and a lot would have unfolded since I was last present. So we did work on implementing a variety of strategies. The teacher, as in the case study, was not able to be very effective in implementing them. So they didn't, not surprisingly, have a huge impact, and things escalated very quickly to the team just wanting the child out. I think if I were to look back and have an opportunity to revisit that case today, I think I would have emphasized the trauma in that child's background much more so, because I think that was really not sufficiently recognized in terms of the behaviors that we were seeing. And I did see a lot of need for trusted adult connection, which really ended up being the opposite of what the child got. And I think that was one of many reasons why it did escalate so quickly.
Well, I really appreciate you sharing that. When we come to these conferences, I think it's really important that we have to share all sides of what we come into contact with. And I think that's a very, very real example. Yes, someone's just saying, I just dealt with this. I think that is very real. So unfortunately we do have to conclude our time. We have another set of workshops starting in just 15 minutes. So Rachel, again, thank you so very much. And thank you to everyone who participated. Fantastic questions. Really very appreciative to everyone. Thanks, Sarita, for the great tech hosting in the background. And we'll see everyone soon. Thank you.